Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Hello, everyone. It looks like we've got our panelists online. Welcome to the MIT Faculty Forum. I'm Robin Kazmier, and I'll serve as moderator for this panel. A little bit about me. I'm a science reporter in the Boston area. My background is actually in anthropology and geography, but then I decided to pursue science reporting, and I graduated from MIT last year with a master's in science writing. And now I'm a freelance reporter, and I also work as a researcher with the best team at NOVA. As a reminder, we welcome your questions during this chat. For MIT alumni joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A feature found in your toolbar. For all others listening on YouTube, you may add your questions in the comments field there. We also encourage you to tweet using the hashtag MITBetterWorld. And we'll get to as many questions as we can. Today, we're going to hear from a panel of experts who will discuss their research on artificial intelligence and the future of medicine. Both of our panelists are going to tell us about their background and research, and then we'll open it up to questions. So let's go ahead and get started with Wasim Malik, Assistant Professor at Harvard Medical.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you everyone for joining us on this beautiful day here in Boston. As Robin mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Harvard Medical School, and I have also got an appointment at Mass General Hospital, where I work on the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence tools with particular application to diagnostics and therapeutics for a range of clinical problems. And one of the areas close to my heart is neurological disorders, which is where I focus most of my energy. So I would like to start off and take the opportunity to introduce AI briefly for the uninitiated and try to look beyond the hype as we all come across these days. So when we talk about AI, I think it's important to understand the broader spectrum of estimation theoretic tools and techniques that have been available to us over the past several decades. And if we look back in time, when people started to collect large amounts of data and quantitative analysis became something of interest, we rapidly evolved classical statistical learning techniques, which have been very useful for the last 70 years or longer than that. Those were based on analyzing data by deciphering particular rules and relationships across data, inputs and outputs, and therefore trying to model the underlying system in a very white box kind of manner. Then things evolved to the point of getting a little more black boxy, and we can refer to those techniques broadly as machine learning, in which there was some aspect of rules, but also a little bit of just correlating the inputs and outputs and trying to discover things not by hand, but by whatever patterns might exist, which may be very complex and nonlinear and not easily understandable heuristically. Then we get on to the age of artificial intelligence, and things really took off back into the 1980s in that sphere. And the idea there was to come up with almost completely black boxy type techniques in which we don't necessarily know the direct input-output relationships, and we use some data-driven techniques to learn those relationships. Usually, one way to also differentiate between these various regimes is that in classical statistical learning, there is a simple kind of curve fitting that we're doing. It's a nice, well-behaved curve, usually within optimal point or maximum or minimum that we can try to identify by error reduction, given the data. In the case of AI, the best applications are where that modeling the surface is a very complex task because it has very complex, typically nonlinear relationships, and there are no clean maximum and minimum. So we just let the data speak for itself. So that's a broad overview. If you look at the techniques in AI that are in use these days, most of them can be considered to be one form or the other of just basic pattern matching. So given a lot of input and output data, we can try to identify patterns that may not be visible to the human eye or decipherable in any other way, but a machine or a computer can pick those out. That seems to be very useful, but it also poses a few challenges which are important to discuss. Most importantly, these kind of techniques, since they're entirely data-driven, they require quite large data sets for training. And we noticed that when AI-based computer vision took off, with the problem of identifying whether an image contained a photo of a cat or not, this training system required billions of training images. Now, of course, in the last 10 years or so, there have been major advances in the field, which have reduced the data requirement. But still, the success of an AI engine really depends on the amount of training data available. The second aspect is the quality of that training data. And this is of particular importance to healthcare applications because a lot of times the training data in healthcare is not clean. A good example of that would be electronic health record data, which typically has a lot of errors due to various human and non-human reasons. So a major step before any AI algorithm can be used productively is to clean up that data and organize it and integrate it from various sources so that it's clean enough for the engine to be able to learn anything useful from it. A third major problem is that there are often challenges with generalizability or sample estimation. So an AI engine would often not be able to give a good answer if it has not seen a similar example before. It's great at interpolation, but not extrapolation. Now let's talk about the advantages that we can get from using AI medicine in healthcare. One of the most key applications is in tasks where things have to be done repetitively, and it's a tedious task, and humans get tired of doing it again and again, but a computer doesn't get tired. So those kind of things are particularly available to the use of computers. Note that that doesn't necessarily require AI. It can also be based with more classical machine learning techniques. But where AI becomes particularly useful is where we don't want to get into identifying the rule sets, or we don't want to get into feature engineering. One particular example that has really taken off is computer-based image analysis. So image analysis or computer vision earlier used to be based on rules that if you have particular kind of shapes or curves, then that indicates the presence of a face or a car in an image. Now with deep learning based AI techniques, we can just train an engine with a lot of sample images and not have to hand pick features and specify them in the form of rules. And that's very useful because a lot of times, not only does it save us from feature engineering, which could be erroneous and problematic, but it also identifies new features that we may not have known to exist in that data, but that can be very useful in our classification problem. If you look at some of the applications of AI in the life sciences, we can think about some case studies here. One major area is in computer vision, where deep learning has proven to be very powerful. And that is in part due to the topological characteristics of an image. Typically, there are local correlations in 2 dimensions in an image or in 3 dimensions in a video, which an AI system can make use of. And often that can be very helpful in identifying the presence or absence of a particular shape, an object, or multiple objects and relationships between them using automated techniques. One example of that is in the analysis of radiological images, for example, CT scans or MRIs. And there are many examples we've seen in recent literature where people have demonstrated this application in its power with claims that such algorithms can yield performance equivalent to a human, expert-trained human radiologist. Another example, which is similar, but if you go to a one-dimensional system, is time series modeling and analysis. There too, AI systems can make use of relationships in time within a time series data set and similarly use the topological relationships to provide a feature-less or automated engine for analysis of that kind of data. And I'll share with you one example from the research going on in my lab where we've been using some of these techniques for time series data analysis. What we wanted to do was to model the entire human neuromuscular system and to study how commands are generated in the human brain in the motor cortex, transported down the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves, the neuromuscular junction, and down to muscles, including, of course, the musculoskeletal system of the muscles and joints and their interaction together. For this, we have been working on developing a deep learning-based AI system, and this is an ongoing project in collaboration between Harvard Medical School and MIT. And we have found that AI-based techniques are very powerful in estimating the role of the various parts of the human motor circuit, because we are using a multi-layer deep learning neural network. We are able to use the features of that network architecture to identify how the information flows across the motor circuit, informed by biology and what we know about the human motor system. And then also the transformations down at the spinal cord module level, further downstream at the peripheral nerves, and then the muscle level. All of these things are made possible just because we are able to measure movement, kinematics, and EMG electromyogram signals, which provide us the input-output signals required to train an AI system. We don't necessarily need to identify the exact transformations that would take place at every step, which would be a very hard system to model. So we have got very promising results so far. I'd be happy to talk more about it in Q&A if anyone is interested. But I want to move on to a third application, which is the classification between different types of populations of patients, for example, or different disease types. An example, again, from my lab of this kind of research is we have been looking at using data from Parkinson's disease patients and using AI techniques to identify which patients have Parkinson's and which of them have some other similar movement disorder. And furthermore, which people are normal. So if we can identify some rule-based system or some AI system which can give us good diagnostic capability, that can serve as a very powerful virtual assistant or a decision support system that can be used in a clinician's office or even as an at-home system to enable people to make that decision, either without the need of including a doctor in the loop or as a first step to triage to which patient should be taken on to a doctor for further in-depth analysis. Now, I want to close by zooming out a little bit and looking at things within the realm of healthcare applications, but outside of more concrete life sciences type applications. So by that, what I mean is, if we look at the broad healthcare system, and particularly the value drivers economically, a lot of the healthcare spendings are actually in the space of patient management in hospitals, patient recruitment in clinical trials. Also, when we talk about payers, a major area of interest is fraud detection and claims. All of these things have actually seen major boosts from the use of AI techniques. And there are many examples of these that I'm happy to talk about. The thing to note here is that all of these examples I just gave have been shown to be economically very impactful by various studies from health economics researchers, and sometimes an order of magnitude greater in terms of financial impact and revenue generation compared to the life sciences diagnostic applications such as image analysis. So I'll close here and happy to continue the discussion and go on to the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Wasim. And to the alumni logging in, just a reminder that you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A box on your toolbar. So our next panelist is Joshua Chang, Assistant Professor at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. Joshua, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. So my name is Joshua Chang. I graduated undergraduate and master's degree from MIT. And during my time there, my focus was in signal processing and artificial intelligence. I worked for a couple of years as a software developer and IT consultant before entering into medical school at the University of Massachusetts, where I got both my MD and my PhD. My PhD being in quantitative health sciences, where we actually looked at a lot of computational neuroscience and dynamical systems. The big question we were trying to tackle, and I'm still working on right now, is one that I'm pretty excited about, where there's a lot of interest today in moving towards using electricity as a form of medical stimulation for therapeutics. We're all fairly familiar with the idea of pharmaceuticals, where there are drugs or chemical compounds that we can use to treat certain disorders or certain diseases. But with recent advances in technology and a better understanding of how the body works now, there's this push towards using electrical stimulation on the nervous system to correct different dysfunctions and disorders in the body as well. So say, for instance, someone that's suffering from epilepsy or Parkinson's disease, there are FDA-approved devices out there that will stimulate the deep brain structures like the subthalamic nucleus or the globus pallidus. And in doing so, this will actually then suppress some of their symptoms. So this is especially useful and targeted really for the population that don't respond well to pharmaceutical therapies or the traditional line of drugs. So for instance, with epilepsy, 30% of patients will actually not respond well to medication, no matter which medication is given or what combination of medications are given. And oftentimes these patients may not be eligible for surgery because they're either too fragile or they either just elect not to do the surgical procedure. And so therefore they would be good candidates for these forms of electroceutical therapies. Now, most of these electroceutical therapies, though, currently are using what's known as rectangular biphasic waveforms, which are these blocky, stimulus where it's turned on for some duration of time, for some amplitude, and then turned off for some duration of time. And then this cycles for some given frequency. And clinicians can adjust these frequencies or these parameters, both the duration, the amplitude, and the frequency, accordingly to try to optimize them for each individual patient. But what studies have shown is that oftentimes biology doesn't respond naturally to rectangular biphasic waveforms or these standard waveforms. And actually, there's a lot of wasted energy when these are given to patients. This wasted energy can, from an electrical perspective, can cause depletion of battery life at a much quicker rate, which then often leads to increased numbers of surgeries for patients, which then increases the risk of mortality or morbidity. But on a much more microscopic level, the excess stimulation, especially in the brain, can cause stimulation of neighboring structures. And what this does is then cause a number of adverse side effects for patients. And this can range from headaches to, for some patients, hallucinations or emotional lability, or even some kind of cognitive impairment for some patients. And so what we've been trying to do is develop algorithms that can learn from patients' behavior or physiological measurements or metrics. How do we optimize these waveforms to minimize the amount of electricity necessary to stimulate them while still maintaining the same outcomes afterwards? Much of this has been done so far in using computer models, or we've developed computational models for different hypotheses of how epilepsy works, and trying to then run these algorithms on these models to try to find optimized waveforms. And what we've actually found is that optimal waveforms can beat rectangular waveforms, sometimes on the order of using only 10% of the energy that's normally used or currently used in most standard practices today. So from here, what we're hoping to do in the near future is then actually start testing this on animal models and then moving on to potentially testing this in a clinical setting in the future. But a lot of this is done such that we're basically reading some kind of feedback from the patient, and then using that information, these algorithms will then intelligently evolve based off of the feedback that we're reading from these patients. And so if we want to look at it from the learning approach, we've got basically some training data with known outcomes. And then using that, we can then feed this all into a machine learning system to develop smarter and better stimuli the next time around. And one thing we think is really cool about this method and this procedure is that it's basically developing customized waveforms for each individual patient. No two patients really have the same pathology or pathophysiology. They don't have the same neural wiring in their brain. And so it seems, it stands to reason that it doesn't make sense for the exact same stimulus waveform to be useful for every single patient to the same level of efficacy. And so by customizing these waveforms using intelligent algorithms and intelligent systems, what we're doing is basically developing personalized medicine, personalized ultraceutical therapies for individual patients. The other aspect that we think is really interesting is that what this furthermore does is it's an adaptive algorithm that's constantly learning from the patient. And as we all know, biology is always adapting to what's going on to external stimuli. I met one gentleman who actually has a spinal cord stimulator in his back because he's got chronic back pain. And while the stimulation worked great for the first 4 to 5 months, the efficacy of it started tapering down over time. And this is either due to perhaps changes in his biology, whether the spinal cord itself is starting to adapt to the electrical stimulation, starting to perhaps get calloused a little bit, or tissue is starting to burn a little bit, and so therefore it's not responding to the electrical stimulation to the same degree as it used to, or perhaps the electrode has moved or shifted because he's bumped it, or for any number of reasons, there's differences that may decrease the efficacy of a treatment over time. And so by developing these algorithms that are constantly learning and constantly monitoring patients' outcomes, we can basically develop these optimized waveforms that kind of tailors itself to patients as things advance. And so that's the majority of the work that we're doing right now is along those lines. But on top of that, here at Dell Medical School, there's a lot of interest in developing what's known as clinical decision support systems. And so how can we develop better tools in the hospital to help clinicians to help improve their workflow, improve their process. And as Wasim had mentioned earlier, a lot of the data that we do get in the hospital is actually quite, for lack of a better term, dirty data. As was mentioned, our health record systems are not always done the same way, either because clinicians decide to write their notes. Each clinician has their own voice in their notes, and it's hard to necessarily parse out all the information that's there. Signals that we're collecting, physiological waveforms that we collect in the ICU, for instance, often have motion artifacts or noisy artifacts that are in the system. And so therefore, simple thresholdings for alarm systems in the ICU are often easily triggered by these things, which then contributes to the large number of false alarms we have in the ICU. And so there's a lot of work that we're looking at here in terms of applying both signal processing tools as well as machine learning and artificial intelligence to both clean up these signals and also develop systems such that we can aid in what clinicians do on a normal basis. So yeah, I don't know if there's any questions. I'd be more than happy to talk about this some more.
Okay, and I know you had mentioned you might have a presentation you're interested in sharing. Is that?
I could, if people want to know more about the ultraceutical work, but we could do that based off of questions too.
Okay, well, why don't we then move on to some of the questions and then see if there's a kind of a gateway into that. So one question's come in. What is your opinion about FDA approval of diagnosis and treatment based on black box machine learning algorithms? For either of you.
I can start off on that. So I think what we have noticed in about the last 1 year is that FDA has opened up not just to AI, but all sorts of machine-driven and computer-aided diagnostics and therapeutic regimes in everything from, in areas like ophthalmology, oncology, radiology, also medical devices, also administering treatments, and perhaps more interestingly, more recently, as companion diagnostics to new drugs that are being approved. So I think with the recent changes in the FDA administration, we are seeing the agency warming up to all sorts of machine learning aided approaches. And And rightly so, I think, because there is a lot of evidence now that these AI and machine learning-based approaches can not only improve the background working and the administrative and economic aspects of providing healthcare delivery to a large population, but also there are ways in which they can prove very effective for becoming a part of a treatment. And I'll give you one example, which I was recently working on, which was the use of an algorithm to do quantitative histology of a tissue sample. Instead of a human reader sitting down and counting thousands of cells on each slide, we can now use computer vision algorithms based on deep learning AI to identify and count cells and classify cells which are healthy versus which are diseased as a result of administering a drug and therefore quantifying the efficacy. Those kind of applications are a no-brainer, and the FDA is welcoming those advances.
Okay. Do you, and this is, I mean, I'm just curious from what I've learned a little bit, do you think that is the FDA fully prepared to evaluate these kinds of technologies, especially as quickly as they develop?
I think it's hard to keep pace with the development of technology because there's so much interest in technology development right now in this field, including in healthcare and outside in everything, in computer vision and autonomous driving and everything else. The pace is pretty fast. So the good news is that the FDA and other government organizations are now very keen to engage in the discussion, whether they are equipped to keep pace and go with the same kind of enthusiasm as the researchers is another question. And perhaps in their role, regulators should be careful because it directly affects human lives. So it's perhaps good to take the sweet time to understand the safety and efficacy of an algorithm before putting it out as a treatment.
Okay.
I think a lot of, sorry, I think a lot of this also depends on what kind of device or diagnostic therapies we're talking about too. I think machine learning can be applied in a whole wide range of different things that the FDA could approve or not approve. And I think it's hard to say across the board that they should approve of most things or not, depending on the black box system. I think there are decision support systems where it's a machine learning system that works in conjunction with a clinician, which adds that second layer of validity to what's going on or to whatever outcomes are being spat out by the machine learning algorithm. The other thing I was thinking is actually that oftentimes a lot of these machine learning algorithms can be done in conjunction with existing research, such that even if it is a black box system, the output of whatever the black box is spitting out can sometimes actually advance scientific knowledge or understanding of a specific system to the point where we do understand what's going on behind the black box because of initially what was a black box approach. And so through that process, I think then when you have this kind of symbiosis between human researchers and black box machine learning algorithms, I think then there's a better chance of security, I guess, and knowing that if the FDA was to approve it, there's some logic and some understanding of what's going on behind it, as opposed to if the FDA was supposed to approve something that no one knew anything about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a couple questions coming in related to AI and genomics. So I'll ask this first one. Are you aware of any R&D project using machine learning and AI for genomic data analytics for clinical diagnostics?
I see a lot of research going on, particularly in the academic institutions like Dana-Farber within the Harvard Medical School system. And certainly there are a lot of companies now, a lot of biotech companies, especially in the Cambridge area, that are looking at various aspects of genomic analysis with AI. Of course, when it's done as a business, the key driver is what the market is. And it's not clear what exactly is the revenue generation and business model for genomic AI approaches. although there are some people who are working with the different, with the various sets of business models around that. So long story short, I mean, there are a lot of different things that people are starting to do. So if there's a more specific question, I can address that.
Okay, well, for people less familiar with that concept, can you, and I know this may be a little bit outside of what you do specifically, can you give an example of what kind of research or project people would use this for in terms of genomics?
Sure.
So
go ahead, Josh.
Go ahead. Well, so I was saying that one of the projects I have seen with regards to genomics is actually looking at patients' response to specific drugs. So not everyone responds to drugs the same way, and so there has been some study looking at, I believe this is in pediatric endocrinology, with certain patients, say diabetic patients, for instance, where instead of having them go through multiple courses of different drugs to find out what's working and what's not working, sometimes they've started looking and analyzing genomic data with relationship to what is the best drug for that particular patient, or that particular set of DNA makeup, to then try to identify what is the optimum drug therapy to start a patient on right from the get-go, as opposed to waiting until 3 or 4 different drugs have been tried on a specific patient.
Mm-hmm. And to pursue a line of inquiry like that, what kind of data would you need to have?
So much of the data that, if I remember correctly, much of the data in this has been looking at, your training data would be the genomic data that comes in, and then the supervised or quote unquote supervised outcomes or labeled outcomes would be the final treatment that has seemed to show the greatest effect or efficacy on the patient. And so you basically be collecting a ton of data on patients that are currently being treated for diabetes, for instance, looking at what has been tried on these patients and what succeeds and what fails, and then using all of that data, then putting that through a machine learning algorithm to try to figure out, given the genetic makeup for a specific individual, what is the likelihood of a certain drug succeeding or not succeeding.
Okay, thank you. I've also got a couple questions coming in related to AI and self-diagnosis, and whether that's in the future. And one question is, what tests or samples will be essential for AI self-diagnosis?
I think it depends entirely on the area we're talking about. So examples where AI-based diagnostics have been useful and gotten FDA approval, I think one major example is diabetic retinopathy in the ophthalmology space, which involves taking a photograph of the retina and using AI algorithms to identify disease versus non-disease state. I can certainly see a future in which that can be done at home with a portable camera. I can see many other similar applications of conducting at-home tests, or if we take it to the space of clinical trials and pharma companies, there are already some companies which are using things like photographs taken by an iPhone to look at dermatology conditions and identify whether a particular dermatological pathology exists or not. So all of those things are examples that are open to self-administration after careful validation and FDA approval.
Okay. Go ahead.
There was also some work done with people with EKG monitors, for instance, if you want to do arrhythmia detection, so that you can, there's a lot of work done with signal processing and artificial intelligence with trying to build better detectors for heart rhythms and things along those lines. I'm not sure if this particular question was also looking at potentially by self-diagnosis, if the idea of an artificial doctor, so to speak. And I know that there's been some work done in that area. Results haven't been as great from what I understand, just because of the wide range of symptom possibilities, as well as a number of directions the questions can go. It just makes the feature space a little bit more complicated, I think. But there is work being done trying to say, for instance, read in information from a case note that a doctor has written and try to develop a differential diagnosis for a patient, and then suggests a number of tests or things that the doctor can do to help support them in the intake of a patient to the hospital.
Okay. I want to move to a little bit more of a general question. Someone asks, people have been working on AI in medicine since the 70s. What's different now? Is it just a huge increase in computer power?
I think that's a great question and a great criticism on the hype we see around AI in the current environment. And this expands beyond medicine. This applies to all AI. What is different right now? What is so magical about AI now? That suddenly we have Elon Musk thinking that AI will take over the world. So if we look a little carefully at the implementations of AI algorithms, there are certainly some techniques that have evolved over the last decade or so, which have taken us in new directions. But as the question pointed out, it definitely is more computing power and more data availability. Those are the two main factors that have led to exploding interest and applications. If we didn't have powerful computers like we do today, GPUs and clusters and so on, then we simply wouldn't be able to process large amounts of data and calculate the pattern matching algorithms and models that are needed for AI to work. Similarly, if we didn't have billions of images of Google and YouTube available, we would not be able to have the right data to feed into those algorithms. So those are the key determinants. There are a relatively small number of actual algorithmic advances that have been made, small but important. But a lot of the structures and architectures that we deal with in neural network technology do date back to the 1980s.
Okay. One question that I've had in learning a little bit more about this is, does this open up a new kind of field of ethical concerns in medical research from your perspective?
I don't think it's necessarily a new field of ethical concerns. I think a lot of the concerns that we've had from previous, I think, so let me step back a little bit. One of the biggest concerns, just because machine learning requires so much data, is privacy of the data, I think. And I think this isn't a new concern. It's been there, from a long time ago, when, as long as we've had to collect data from patients to do statistical analysis, I think this has always been a concern of how do you maintain privacy and how do you maintain a patient's anonymity or confidentiality while doing this kind of research. So I think, considering that machine learning requires so much data, this just kind of compounds the issue some more, and it becomes something that's more important to consider.
And I'll just extend that thought a little bit. I think as Joshua rightly pointed out, those ethical concerns are nothing entirely new. They might have different forms now. So I'll give you an example outside of healthcare. If you look at driverless cars, now there is an entire field of ethics looking at how do we define the policies in case there is going to be an accident, we know for sure, because of merging cars on the highway. Then which car should suffer more of the accident? How many people do we want to kill? That takes us to the trolley problem a little bit. We can think of an analog in healthcare if we are going to triage between two stroke patients on which one gets treatment first. How do we define that? What are the ethics around it? So there are many, many other examples we can come up with, but most of those are essentially extensions of things we would face otherwise for all humans.
Okay.
I think actually one thing that also popped into my mind just now is that there's a little bit of a danger with AI, as let's say we get to a point where we do develop intelligent diagnostic tools using artificial intelligence. If a clinician isn't there reviewing it, at some point there's a liability concern as well with regards to if a machine says that you're diagnosed with such and such, but a human clinician hasn't looked at it, or we get to a point where human clinician doesn't need to look at it, then kind of who's responsible for that diagnosis? Is it the company? Is it the device? If there's an error because of computing glitches or whatever, again, the issue of who's responsible, I guess, is kind of a little bit of a conundrum that comes up as if AI continues to become more and more prevalent at the expense of a good set of human eyes.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. We're getting a lot of questions about specific, we're really focusing on applications. So I want to ask this one, and this is pretty broad, but oops, just down. Someone asks, what about using AI, machine learning, or visual analytics in helping with medication management, helping with areas like medication reconciliation, compliance, and medication conflict for complex patients?
So that's a very important question, and medical compliance and adherence is one of the major concerns in clinical practice and in pharma research, because depending on which study you look at, 50 to 70% people never follow the prescribed dosage and the regimen of drugs that their clinician gives them. And in clinical trials, if that's the case, then it becomes very hard to determine the efficacy or safety of a drug when the right dosage is not being followed. So there's a lot of interest in any kind of new technologies that can enable us to perform better in the drug compliance space. There are certainly applications that have come out that make use of AI. There is a company, for example, that makes an app. So every time you take a drug, you take a selfie, and the AI at the back end runs some computer vision algorithms to identify that it is you indeed who's taking that drug, and you've taken the right dosage at the right time, and so on. It's up to the market to determine what the traction of that technology can be, or if patients actually use it or not. But there are many other applications that are coming out that use various kinds of measurements and signals, whether they're in the background or they require more of the user intervention, like the example I just gave, which are based on AI technology. Very important area, though.
I think for some of the other components with regards to, say, I'm trying to remember the question now, but people with complex patients that have a lot of medications, I have seen some tools that have tried to classify and help pharmacologists, pharmacists determine whether a new drug that they're going to be adding to the list, by another specialist may have some kind of conflicting benefit with existing drugs on the patient's existing drug list already. And so there are some tools in that area that are working in that field to try to help prevent some of these drug reactions that may occur in patients. But I think from what I understand, most of these are rule-based systems as opposed to using more machine learning approaches. There has been also some work done, I think, with medical compliance in terms of monitoring patients, and at least in the hospital, trying to see if there's immediate effects from the patients and trying to use that to determine whether or not the patient has actually taken their drugs or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question. So one person asks, they say they're interested in learning more about potential cost savings for AI applications in the healthcare sector. They ask about particular researchers or research that you would recommend following, but I would kind of broaden that to say, can you speak a little bit to this overall potential for cost savings?
If I understood the question correctly, you're asking about what cost savings are possible with the use of these AI technologies. So we can look at a lot of different things. There was a study I saw recently by Accenture in which they estimated the financial impact of AI-based cost saving to be somewhere on the order of $150 billion. That is the potential. That's not realized, but that's a big number. And I think some of the areas identified were the things that I mentioned earlier on, things like patient selection for clinical trials. So let's drill deeper into that a little bit. In the drug development and discovery universe, typically a clinical trial, late-stage clinical trial runs for a year or two. Typically, it takes about $1 billion to develop a new drug. Each day that a clinical trial is delayed by is estimated to cost anything from $1 to $8 million, depending on whether it's a blockbuster drug, then it's close to $8 million per day. That's a huge financial impact. So if we can use machine learning or AI to identify patients correctly that can then be enrolled in that clinical trial, and there are many companies which are trying to do this, then there's a huge payoff financially. And of course, it also improves the possibility of getting the right drug, getting it approved, getting it faster to patients, faster to market, and directly saving lives. So there's the human and financial impact that's there from this one example. There are many other areas where back-end improvements, process workflow management, analysis of EHRs for identifying the right patients for triaging treatments, and many other applications where there can be huge financial impact. And it's relatively low-hanging fruit. It doesn't require too much new science or engineering development, but just identifying the right applications and working on them.
Okay. Let's see. Another question. We've got a couple questions coming in about Alzheimer's. One person asked, Joshua mentioned using electricity for people with epilepsy and Alzheimer's. This requires surgery, cutting into the brain, which is rather dangerous. Are there any research into non-surgical means? I seem to recall ultrasound was high on the list, but have not heard much recently.
So yeah, there definitely are some research avenues around that. Non-invasive, there's some people that are studying transcranial stimulation, so then stimulate from actually outside the skull. I haven't seen a lot of results in that direction, but there are people that are looking at that. Same with transcranial magnetic stimulation. I do know also for people that have epilepsy, there's things that actually try to focus on cortical stimulation or cortex stimulation of the brain. So not stimulating the deep structures of their brain, but stimulating the surface of their brain. And so therefore you're not diving too deep into the brain. There's also work done, I'm trying to remember, it's not for Alzheimer's disease, but I know for epilepsy, there are people that are looking at stimulating the vagus nerve, which actually runs through through the chest as opposed to having to just only be done in the brain. And so therefore you could do surgical, you do have to implant a device, but it's outside of the brain and it's more on the vagus nerve, which kind of runs through the body as opposed to just in the brain. So there are different things that are being studied to try to see if we could move away from deep brain stimulation. That being said, deep brain stimulation is being used right now. It is FDA approved, and from what I understand, at least with Parkinson's disease, I think there's about 90,000 some patients in the States as of a few years ago that have these deep brain stimulators walking around right now and are being treated for their Parkinson's with these stimulators. And again, oftentimes using electrostimulation like this is not first line or even second line. These are often when all else fails, this is the therapy that people go to when nothing else works.
Okay, great. So getting a lot of questions about specific areas of medicine, Alzheimer's, radiology, cancer. So I want to sort of combine those and ask, one person's question is there an area of medicine or areas that are more promising for the application of AI than others? Or one specific area you think is particularly promising, or how do you gauge that kind of thing?
So I think we've seen a lot of results actually in radiology with image studies, just because of all the work that's been done in image-related AI systems, and a lot of that has carried over into recognizing and reading radiological imaging. So, and that particular field is relatively low cost in that it's not directly interacting with the patient. It can be reviewed by a clinician. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in that particular area. And as Wasim mentioned earlier, from a dermatological perspective, there's been a lot of work done on trying to recognize moles and things on the skin so that people can take a snapshot with their phone, send it in, and get it analyzed. And so these are what I would consider low-hanging fruits.
I agree with Joshua. I think to think about it a little more systematically, we can think of areas where AI technology has been developed outside of healthcare. And computer vision is probably by far the biggest area. So that means there are direct applications of that within healthcare applications, like Joshua said, in various kinds of image analysis and radiology and elsewhere. Also, another regime is where we have very large data sets available, and we don't necessarily have the means or the understanding to processing them efficiently. And that leads us into examples such as EHR analysis. We certainly have lots of patient records now electronically available. And I think the state of healthcare is still struggling to come up with ways of evolving AI technology to work with those health records. As we discussed before, one big reason is that clean data is not available. So a big step is just cleaning up data. But then going beyond that, once we have good data sets available, what can we do with them? How can we combine those large data sets coming in from providers, clinicians, and from payers, from pharma companies, from consumers directly wearing their own wearable devices and Fitbits and so on. And then if we can combine all of those together and find patterns that we haven't otherwise discovered, that can be very valuable too.
Okay. And we need to begin winding down here, but I want to throw at least one more question out here. One person asks, beyond diagnosis, which is typically only a minority part of the medical treatment challenge, what AI work is being done to dynamically guide treatment of disease? Can AI do a better job of staying abreast of best evidence, clinical data, and patient response to optimize a patient's treatment plan for illnesses like diabetes, heart failure, or depression?
So I can give a couple of examples of things that are being done outside of diagnostics, but I want to acknowledge that's a great question. And a lot of times in medical research, we think of diagnostics and not therapeutics, even though the market dynamics are very different. The way the FDA approves drugs is very different. Obviously, we need to think of therapeutics, of developing new drugs and devices that can help patients and save lives. But this also goes back to a point I made earlier in which I mentioned companion diagnostics, which are diagnostics, but they usually are thought of as a part of a therapeutic regime. So we don't necessarily need to differentiate diagnostics and therapeutics too much. But going back to the question, I think if we think more broadly, there are a lot of great applications being worked on, a lot of great research being done, including at my institution, at Mass General, on identifying which patients need urgent care and using all sorts of pattern matching techniques based on health records, on image analysis, other tests, any other kind of data, based on which we can deploy AI engines in the emergency room or in intensive care units to address urgent care for stroke, for example. In stroke, the wisdom is that time saved is brain saved. So administering care immediately is very important. Of course, we can't do that to all patients that arrive at a healthcare facility. So we have to figure out some way of identifying where we have the potential to save the most brain tissue in which patient. And then there is a lot of research being done in my institution at this point on algorithms which can help us make those kind of decisions, which are often hard for humans to make. There are many other examples. I'm sure Joshua has a few to speak to as well.
So I was trying to, when I was thinking about the question, I think it depends on what kind of treatments that we're talking about. So if we're talking about, say, for instance, something like diabetes, where much of it is done through medical treatments today, it's a little bit, I don't know if AI necessarily has an immediate role that I can imagine. And the reason why I say that is because when we give a person a drug to test, it often takes, we have them stay on that drug for some period of time just to see how well the drug is taking an effect on the patient's blood glucose level, for instance. The turnaround isn't very fast. And so the idea of collecting a lot of data to feed information in terms of dynamically guiding treatment of disease for a specific patient is not as readily available, just because you don't have that many iterations or that many data points for a specific patient. That being said, I think there's a lot of work in dynamically gathering information from a population of people, where we can, as I mentioned earlier, using genomic data, we can try to predict what patient will respond well to a specific drug, and then gather information on how well that patient actually does respond to that drug, to then feed into developing better models for these prediction algorithms. The second part of your question with regards to staying abreast of best evidence, clinical data, and patient response, I think there's a lot of work done in this, or there's a lot of people trying to develop these kinds of AI systems that can kind of say, for instance, mine PubMed to try to build these knowledge coupling systems that will gather best practices and clinical data. And as far as I can tell, these things haven't had great results yet. One key example is IBM's Watson has been tackling cancer treatments for some time now. And while they've had some success in certain areas, there's also been some weakness, just because predominantly the literature is pretty varied on some of these topics. And so if we were just simply mining what PubMed says, for instance, there are at times conflicting results, but due to different changes in certain studies, perhaps it's the population in the specific study that is conflicting or not generalizable. And so I think we haven't yet gotten to a point yet where we have an AI system that can just immediately mine for best evidence and clinical data to create automated treatment plans for patients.
Okay, great. Well, I think with that, we need to wrap up. On behalf of the Alumni Association, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this faculty forum online. Thanks again to our alumni panelists from the University of Texas at Austin and Harvard Medical. We didn't get to all the questions submitted, but we will forward all the questions to the panelists. You can tweet about today's chat using the hashtag MITBetterWorld. And you can send any follow-up questions or feedback to alumnilearn@mit.edu. Thanks again so much for watching.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.